The round you're about to see takes place at Copetown Woods, and we had to start on the back 9 this morning because there's been a lot of rain in Canada recently, so the front 9 needed a little extra time to dry out, and you can tell by this first swing of the day, I needed a little extra time to wake up. That ball pulled hard right into the fescue where I've had to take a drop, which you'll see in a moment, and thankfully Dan has a much better swing. He plays his traditional slice and ends up finding the middle of the fairway. One of the things I've noticed about my rounds this year is that I don't really have a lot of warm-up time, so I generally struggle on the first couple of holes, and you can see that's what's happening here. So because of that tee shot, I know I'm already playing for bogey. This is a par 5, so it's a little bit generous here, so I have no problem just laying up back into the fairway, and I'll set myself up for an approach shot. Dan does a good job here, also laying up. He could have gone for the green in 2, but there's a lot of bunker protection, so he plays it smart there. I have a nice approach shot and take an absolute beaver tail of a divot, and my goal here was just to get anywhere on the green and try to 2-putt for bogey, so I set myself up for success there, and look at that beauty. Wow. Perfectly cut, stomp it right back in. We can see here that Dan had left himself in a great position. He was about 60 or so yards away, but ends up going a little bit soft on this approach shot, so he ends up short of the green. And I usually see him use a hybrid from here, but he tried to putt this one and left it well short. With how much rain had come in last night, I think that fringe was just full of water, so it made it really tricky. And you can see that I have a pretty decent lag putt up here. I give a little bit of a knee knocker to tap in, but I do save the bogey. And Dan drains a nice putt, and he starts his day off with a par. And considering how terrible my tee shot was, I'm very content with a bogey, because I know that as an average single handicap golfer, there's going to be bogeys in every single round, and it's about not letting them get you too frustrated. So next hole up is a long par 3. It's about 196 yards, which for some reason I thought I could get there with a 5-iron, but that was a terrible decision, especially with it being wet. That ball just did not travel very far. Dan uses his hybrid and has a decent swing on it, and his ball ends up about pin high, but off into the right rough. And you can see I've got a long way to pitch up here, and I got caught up on this ridge on the green. Dan ends up being a little bit too firm with this chip, and it bounces off that same ridge and rolls well past the hole. So we are both basically trying to get 2 putts here and just walk away with the bogey. On a long par 3 like this is another type of hole that I'm not too upset if I don't get the par. I'm just trying to limit the damage here, and I do a good job. Keep that first putt very close, easy tap in. Dan has his attempt for par and goes just to the side, also takes his bogey, and my good vibes are about to be put on hold for a second because I get really lazy with this 5-wood swing. I'm at an awkward distance on this par 4 where I'm just trying to lay it up to about 200 yards, and I end up pulling it into the fescue. Dan puts a more forceful swing on his, and he also goes off to the right, but he'll be in a much better position than me, thankfully. You can see here I am just buried, so I'm just trying to fight that ball out, and as I fall backwards, I am fortunate enough, I make it into the fairway. Dan got fortunate that his ball ended up in a pretty decent spot, and he was able to still get on the green, so he's got himself a birdie putt. Now I would normally use a 60 degree from about 70 yards away, but I decided because it was so wet, I'd just try and punch my pitching wedge up there, but it got caught on that front ridge.
Bro, it's like 2 more yards further and that would have been nice.
But I did not get those yards, so I am left with a monster of a putt, and I am really uncertain about how to put the proper weight on this thing. Not only is it up 2 different ridges, but I know that it's wet, so it's already taking a difficult putt and making it even harder. I blew it way past the hole, and I think Dan kind of overcompensates because he saw how far mine went, so he left his well short. So here I am trying to just put it close enough to save a double bogey, and this is the exact distance I did not want to leave myself. Over top of that putt, I was flooded with negative thoughts, which you never want to have in golf, but thankfully I dropped that, saved it to a 3-putt and a double bogey, and Dan also blows his putt past, but makes the comebacker, so that's a bogey for him. Now if you're watching this video, then you have seen YouTube Golf and you know who Rick Shields is, and this was a perfect opportunity for me to think about a tip that I heard from him once. If you're having a tough round, especially at the start, remember to break it up into groups of 3. So I just had 3 tough holes, bogey, bogey, double bogey, and now I'm just trying to put that out of my mind. I'm saying, here's the next set of 3, so let's try to do better. I end up finding the fairway on the left, and Dan ends up finding the fairway on the right, so we both have a chance to go for this green, and that pin is tucked in a very scary spot. It is over water and on the far left, so Dan is doing a good job here, and he sets up more towards the middle of the green. He puts a pretty decent strike on it, starting to draw in and just clears the water and falls a bit short of the green. I also aim towards the center, and I'm glad I did, because this miss as I push it off to the left only ends up in the left rough, just pin high. So if I would have aimed at the pin, that for sure would have been out of bounds if I would have had the same miss. Dan corrects himself from his first hole where he tried to putt out, and he goes back to his hybrid. It ends up a bit short here on the putt, and you can see that I'm right on the edge of that rough, so I decide to just try and putt out of there. It's kind of awkward putting out of rough, so I end up leaving that short, but tap in, and I got my first par of the day. And Dan drains a beauty of a putt. He also pars the hole. Our fifth hole of the day is a par 5, and I'm only using a 5-wood here because it's pretty narrow landing up there, and I don't want to risk going in any of the bunkers, so I play it nice and short, and I'm just planning to try and get on the green in 3. Dan ends up spraying his ball off to the right here, and this is where he makes a really big mistake. You can see that he's quite buried in this fescue, and he's still trying to use a hybrid. Even with it catching on his practice swing and he knows something's up, he still commits, and then he flubs it. And now he has to still lay out to the fairway. He flips to an iron here, and if he would have just done that on the last shot, he would have been in much better shape, but he's given an extra shot away here just because he got a little too aggressive. I end up hitting a 6-iron here, and it ended up being a pretty good distance because I wanted to leave myself about 100 yards into the green, and I got pretty close. And you can see Dan unfortunately flubs that iron shot, and he's off to the right there. He has an approach in from the rough and ends up being a bit short of the green, and this hole's really getting away from him as he ends up in the bunker. And here I am about 95 yards away, so I was pretty close to the 100 yards I wanted. I put a pretty good swing on it, but the perception of where that pin was really kind of played some tricks on me. I thought I was going to be pin high, but I end up being quite a bit short. However, it's going to be okay. And Dan is hitting out of his bunker, but really stopped his swing there for some reason, so he ends up short and he has to chip on. And just like he had on hole 2, he ends up chipping it a little bit too firm, and he's leaving himself quite a long putt to try and get the triple bogey. So after 3 very conservative shots, I have this long birdie attempt, and I put a pretty decent putt on it. I leave it a little bit further away from the hole than I would have liked for par, but I end up tapping that in, and that is now back-to-back. So I've started off this second set of 3 holes with 2 pars. Dan ends up missing that putt and has to take a 9, and that's certainly a hole he'd like to forget. So let's just instantly move on to our next hole, which is a par 4. And I put a nice smooth swing on this driver, and I end up finding the fairway. Dan slices his drive off to the right, but this is a nice landing spot because there's actually a little bit of fairway in between the previous hole and this current hole. So he managed to find that, and then has one of his nicest shots of the day as he just throws an absolute dart at this flag. It goes just behind, checks up, and sits on the green. For my approach, I'm using about a 3/4 swing on a 52 degree because I find this gives me a much more controlled swing, in particular with my aiming. And the one thing I didn't quite compensate for here is that I had a wind behind me. So this ball ended up going a little bit further than I expected. So I've left myself quite a lengthy birdie putt, and I'm giving it a good look, again, from both sides of the green because I like to take that look from the low side of the hole. And I have this putt right on line, but just didn't give it enough power. However, that's a really nice par, and I'm stringing a couple nice holes together here. Dan has a good look at his birdie putt here and puts a nice stroke on it, but it ends up going just a little bit to the left, so he has a tap in for par, which I decide to stop with the pin. I'll just save him that little bit extra bending. It's amazing how much your spirits can start to change in the game of golf by just putting a couple of good holes together, and it's very important to keep that fun alive when you're playing the game. And you can see that my next swing is still feeling very confident here. I put that drive right out to the middle left of the fairway, and Dan ends up stepping to his and has a little bit more slice to his right than he would have liked, and he ends up in this fairway side bunker, and he has a pretty solid strike on this one, but didn't quite aim it far enough left, and he ends up back in another bunker. And with this being a par 5, I try to make a nice conservative approach here. Instead of going for the green, which is about 230 yards away, I just lay up with a 6-iron and leave myself a nice approach in. And here's why.
Could I have gone for the green in 2? You betcha. Am I a good enough golfer that it might have worked out? Yeah, sometimes. But do I know myself well enough to know that the risk is not worth the reward? Yes, 100%. That is a safe layup. Sometimes you just have to do that. Get your ego out of the way if you want to play good golf.
And as we get closer to the green here, you'll notice exactly why I played conservative. You can kind of see on Dan's approach shot here that there are bunkers on either side of that green, so it's a really narrow landing spot to get up there. So rather than trying to play hero and get anywhere on the green and risk going into one of those bunkers, I laid up to a nice spot in the fairway, which gave me this great chance to approach the pin, and thankfully I made it count by throwing a really nice shot in there. Dan is trying to follow suit so that he can try and get close enough to save his par, but he got a little unlucky with that first bounce out of the rough, that it checked up a little quicker than he would have liked. So this is a long par putt attempt, and he puts that really far out to the side, and I'm not sure exactly where his line was there. And then he tries to tap it in, and again, and again. I don't know what he scored here. So as I set up for my birdie putt here, I know that it breaks pretty hard to the right, but it is downhill, so it was very delicate for me to try and get the speed right, and I was just a little bit off. So a really good look at birdie, but a nice, clean, safe par on that par 5. And that brings us to this really short downhill par 3, which I try to draw in towards the pin, and it stays a little bit left to the side there. I have a little bit better view of the green here. I held the camera a little higher for Dan's shot, and you can see he missed just a bit left of mine as well. And you can see based on our ball positions there that we are basically on the exact same line of the putt, so we worked together here and tried to look at the break as best as we could. Both checked it out from the low side of the hole, and then I take a look from behind because I'm fortunate enough to be closer than Dan's was. And golf is a hard enough game as it is, so take every opportunity you can to get a little bit extra read on your putts. And here is my birdie attempt.
I like that a lot. I like it a lot. Yes. Finally.
I said finally because even though I'm only 8 holes into the round, that is my first birdie of the day as Dan taps in his par. But it felt much longer than that because those first 3 holes were so poor. But the good vibes end on this hole for a moment because I decided to hit my 5 wood to keep the water out of play on the left, but didn't fully commit to that, and I hit well behind the ball, topped it, and I left my approach quite a bit further away than I would have liked. The same is true for Dan after he skies this fairway wood, and he has an approach that splashes off the fairway and then goes way off to the right. You'll kind of see the ball bounce, and then it disappears, and he was not able to find it. And this is where my course strategy takes a big hit. I end up hitting a 6-iron here trying to get to the green, and I spray that right into the water. What I should have done here is used a 7-iron and intentionally played it short right of that hole and just played for the bogey, because you see here I have to drop, so I hit my 4th and it just barely makes it on the green. And while I was making a mess of this hole, I wasn't able to record Dan's shot on, so you can just see it on the green there. So this is a long bogey putt for me to try to make, and I leave myself a little bit of a distance here for the double bogey, and it looked pretty straight in, but when I hit this, it just went hard right, and that's a really gross triple bogey, especially after a birdie, and you'll see that this hole came back to bite me. So here's Dan's bogey putt, and he lips out of that hole, leaves himself basically the exact same putt that I had, but I'm not sure if he just didn't see my putt or didn't trust what happened to mine, but he misses in almost the exact same spot. That's also a tough triple bogey for him. Not a great way to end the front 9. And if you're still with me in this video as I set up for the 10th hole of the day, thank you so much. I would also really appreciate it if you could click that subscribe button if you have not done so already. I'm trying to reach 500 subscribers by the end of the summer. And this ends up being a really good hole to demonstrate the importance of just sticking with your game plan, because I really hit a bad shot off the tee here, and I end up just in the very short right side of the fairway. And Dan follows me over there, but goes a little bit further right, so he's in the rough, and he hits a really nice shot here that gives himself a good approach onto the green. And I try to do the same with my approach 7-iron here. And you can see how absolutely drenched that fairway is. And this is probably why we started on the back 9. And I thought that I hit a really good shot still, but I ended up just near the end of that fescue patch. So I had to fight that thing out. I tried to aim right and it went way left. So Dan has a nice approach here. He ends up on the front side of the green and he leaves himself a long birdie putt. And I'm out of the left rough there, so I'm still trying to just get on the green and possibly save a chance at a par. And I throw a really nice shot in there, and I was really proud of myself for that because I was coming off a triple bogey from the last hole, a bad tee shot, and a bad break on the second shot, and it ended up not getting in my head too much. And we can see Dan's birdie putt misses just off to the right there, so he's got a chance at his par. And this is probably one of my favorite putts of the day, as that was perfect pace and line.
Not all pars are created equal.
Nice par.
Thank you. That is certainly a par that feels like a birdie.
And this is why it's so important to just stick to your game. Try not to let the bad shots get in your way, because you can see Dan and I both had really rough starts to that hole, and we both finished with pars. The next hole, we have a par 4 that I lay up with a 5-wood, end up pulling a little bit more right than I would have liked, and Dan sets up far left and slices his shot into the fairway. And he has a good chance at an approach here, but just fats that thing, and it did not go far. I think I lowered the volume enough so that you could not hear the word that came out of his mouth, and then his second approach shot ends up a bit short. So I try to muscle mine up towards the green, and because it was a little bit deeper rough than I would have liked, I end up just short. Thankfully did not go in the bunker, and thankfully I'm very comfortable with my 60-degree wedge, so I just flop that thing up there and leave myself a chance at the par putt, and I'll be okay if I end up bogeying it.
Hey, you're gonna give me a nice read.
I am again. 3 reads.
And because Dan's chipping is not necessarily the strongest part of his game, and he sculled that thing a little bit, I try to joke around by making a comment that he's giving me a nice look at a putt again, and you can see that he does a pretty good job reading that break, and gives me a really great read. And I thankfully capitalize again with an absolutely terrible celebration, but those are back-to-back pars that I feel very fortunate with. So I try to keep the momentum going here as we approach this really sharp dogleg right par 4. I end up with a nice smooth 3-wood that I do a really good job of drawing around that corner a bit and actually shaved off some distance. Dan ends up skying his fairway wood a little bit more again, and you can see the green all the way down there. And because the pin is at the back and there's some front bunker position on the right, he's setting up to try and hit a bit of a fade here, and unfortunately he pulls it a little bit to the left, but fortunately he does stay short of that fescue and he's got a chance to pitch onto the green. Now I tried something a little bit different than I'm used to here, as I use a 9-iron and try for about a 3/4 swing. This is normally something I've only been doing with my lower wedges, but I thought it was a good chance here because I was into some wind, and it ended up being an okay shot, but I kind of hit the front ridge of the green and it just died on me, so I didn't get the bounce forward I would have liked. Dan pitches on, and you can see he got up the ridge, so he's got a chance to at least try and get his par or bogey. My birdie putt ends up going a little bit more to the right than I would have liked, so I've got a tough par putt there. Dan's par putt just misses off to the right as well, and he taps it in for his bogey. So I set up here for my par putt. Yeah, I actually got a little bit of a read off of his tap in, but I didn't take advantage this time, and there's a bogey. This par 3 is only about 120 yards, and because it was directly into some wind, I did not compensate enough for that. I only clubbed up 1, but I probably should have gone 2 clubs up, and I think Dan finds out he should have also done the same thing, because we both end up in nearly identical spots, trying to chip on and save our pars. You can see we have very different approaches here. As he chips his nice and low, he goes for more of the bump and run style. I like using my 56 in this range and trying to land it about halfway from the hole and let the other half roll out, and I almost get to it there. It's close enough I decide to not even take my putter head cover off. I don't even know if that's legal or not, but in she goes, and Dan also taps in his. I mean, that's a pretty straightforward par 3. Nice hole for us. So because my confidence is getting higher here, I decide to still hit my driver even though it's a small landing area up there, and I hit probably my best drive of the day. It's about 275 yards up, and it lands right in the middle of that strip. Dan's goes a little bit off to the right, so he has a chance to approach the green here from a good angle, but he ends up spraying it a bit off to the right side. Now I've got a nice easy swing here. You can see there's that 3/4 swing, and I'm right at that pin. I don't know why I stumbled on my words there, but whatever. And it goes a little bit short. Speaking of short, Dan stops his swing out of his bunker, so he goes in the rough and then pitches on, and then kind of lazily puts that one up there. And I don't know exactly what he's putting for at the moment. I'll have to count that back. And you can see my birdie putt has a decent look at the hole here. Just misses off to the right. And Dan taps in. Oh, just missed that one. And oh, never mind. So the 15th hole of our day is a nice landing area up there that gives me the confidence to pull out that driver again. And there's that little fade that I try to consistently hit. So that's kind of 2 in a row that are near perfect for me. Dan ends up getting a little bit caught up in the wind here, and he was fortunate enough that he was able to stay into the right rough, and then has a nice swing on it, but ends up a little bit short of the green. And I'm in a good distance here where I learned from the previous par 3 where I was a little bit short, and I decided to club up by 2 here, put a nice smooth swing on it, and that was right at the pin and just a little bit behind it, so I'm going to have a really good look at a birdie. Dan has a chance to pitch on and has a nice little shot here, and I'm fortunate that he is behind me again, and it's not the exact same line, but it's close enough that you can see I watched this thing very diligently. Even though he put it way past the hole, I think I got enough of a read, and I have a chance at a birdie. So that putter was really starting to heat up for me by this point in the round, and you could see that I was walking that one in when it was 3 feet away. And then this one, yeah, I'm sorry you couldn't see Dan actually start the putt, but I hadn't changed the camera, and he just hammered it off the back middle of that hole, and it went. So with these final 3 holes, I now have breaking 80 well within my sights, and this par 3, you can see there's that back left pin position. I put a really good swing on it, and I end up being just a bit left of the pin, so I have another birdie putt. Dan sprays his a little bit off to the right, so he has a tricky pitch on here, and he does a really good job of it, and I actually thought this was going to be absolutely perfect, but as it rolled over that ridge, it really started to pick up some speed, and it rolled quite a bit further away from the hole than it looked like it would be. So I have my birdie putt that was here. You can see it was about pin high, and I just did not give it enough power, but that's a nice easy tap in for par. So Dan was able to get a little bit of a read off of my putt, even though we're slightly different angles, and he's lined up really nice here, but you can see he just pushes that putt off to the right, so he ends up having to tap in for bogey. So right now my score is sitting at a 70, and these final 2 holes are both par 4s, which means if I can play these 2 holes at +1 or better, I will finally break 80 this season. Dan ends up hitting his iron off to the right side of the fairway, and his approach ends up being this kind of cool accidental stinger as he clears the water, but he doesn't get the kind of bounce he would have liked. So it ends up a bit short. I aim for the center of the green, just trying to get on, but I pull this shot. And I am very disappointed with where this ends up in the fescue.
As I set up, I had this feeling it was slightly too far forward.
And you can hear me explain why, and it's really not a good feeling when you're standing over the ball and you feel like something is a little bit off. So you need to step back and readjust. You can see I'm out of the long stuff there, and I'm trying to just hack it onto the green and give myself a chance to save a bogey, and I end up short, so I try to pitch that one close, and that rolls quite a bit further away. So now I have that putt for bogey just to try and keep my hopes of breaking 80 alive. Dan ends up missing his chip quite a bit low of the hole there, so here comes my bogey putt. And holy crap, I made it. So I know that breaking 80 is still possible, as we see Dan's putt just miss a bit to the right there. So now the stage is set for myself to try and just play this as smooth and easy as possible, needing par to break 80. And I started off with a beautiful fade drive that ends up in the left side of the fairway. So I'm already in the mindset that I'm just trying to hit the green and 2-putt for par. I'm not trying to get too aggressive. As we watch Dan kind of hit his drive, and then his approach shot is a little bit short. So here I am, I've got a 9-iron in hand. I'm setting off to the kind of left side and middle of the green. It's almost the same shot as last hole. I just don't want to pull it right, and I pull it right. You can see I am very disappointed, not good body language. That ends up in a really tricky spot where I'm going to have to pitch out of the fescue and hopefully give myself a chance to save the par. Now I did get really lucky, you can't see from this angle, but it's sitting up enough that I can get under my 60 degree, and I absolutely flub it. And I'm in a worse spot where that is buried. I now know that breaking 80 is over, and it's a really tricky position to be in because I know I played a good round, but the triple bogey on the 9th hole and then what ends up being a triple bogey for me also on this hole were real backbreakers. But the strategies are in place, and I know I'll be breaking 80 again soon, so thank you very much for watching this video, and hope to see you in the next one.